Hello, welcome to the next in our series going through the story of Moses. And today we are looking at Exodus 10, verses 1 to 20. And in today's verses and today's reading, we're going to be looking at the eighth plague, which is that of locusts. So if you've not read the verses already, have a read now, pause the video, have a read. Exodus 10, put my teeth in, Exodus 10 verses 1 to 20. So we can see from those verses that God is being really clear now that Pharaoh is trying to show the power he has still. He is still being stubborn, and God is aware of Pharaoh's stubborn nature. We saw last week as well, Moses is really aware of how Pharaoh's heart is, even if his words are saying something different. And Pharaoh's had so many chances to humble himself before God, to really see what God is doing and understand what God is doing through the plagues. And for Pharaoh to really acknowledge that God has the ultimate power above anything he has himself and above any other God that Pharaoh believes in. And Pharaoh is really clear on where his true colours are here, on what he's really thinking. And also, just to remind us before we get into this eighth plague, God doesn't want to bring destruction to the people, but he knows Pharaoh is willing to keep going, to go as long as it'll take without him saying yes to let the people go. Pharaoh doesn't want to obey God and doesn't want what God is asking of him. So when Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh with the details of this next plague, it's something that perhaps feels a little foreign to us, this idea of a swarm of locusts. And before we kind of go into detail on everything that happens over these 20 verses, let me just unpack a little bit more of what a plague of locusts, what a swarm of locusts would have been like, for us to try and get our understanding on it. A locust comes from a grasshopper. And a grasshopper, if ever you've seen them, you might have seen them out in the garden or in a nature reserve or by the river or anywhere else out in nature. They're fairly solitary, reserved animals, kind of like to be on their own, kind of keep themselves to themselves kind of animal. However, when a grasshopper has certain conditions that they're living in, has certain kind of breeding type and things like that, and there's certain kind of environmental factors at play and some unusual traits, when grasshoppers breed in those situations, what makes a locust. Now, looking at it on paper, and this is where anyone who is watching this that has an understanding of animals that is greater than mine, but to the kind of layman's eye, a locust and a grasshopper probably look fairly similar. However, a locust has a completely different character to a grasshopper, whereas I've said grasshoppers are quite solitary, locusts are not. They are not kind of placid, reserved creatures. They are really quite aggressive. They breed very quickly. They will consume anything and everything that is put before them. And they aren't solitary. They love to be in swarms, love to be with a lot of other locusts. So we can start to go from what our understanding maybe of a grasshopper is, if we've ever seen one, to a locust that looks similar but has a very different character, where it wouldn't be on its own, there'd be loads of them, it would be quite aggressive, quite noisy in how it would fly and buzz and things like that as well. And when I'm talking about a large group here, I'm not just talking about hundreds. There would be thousands, if not millions, of locusts in a swarm. And there are times in history, not just in the Bible, but other times in history, where locusts have been known to devour regions, if not entire countries, because the swarm is that big. So that gives us a little bit more context, hopefully, into what a swarm of locusts might have been like. And when Moses and Aaron have gone to Pharaoh and said, this is what the next plague is going to be, they also give it some context in these verses. They tell Pharaoh, this swarm of locusts is going to be bigger and worse than anything Egypt or basically anywhere in the world has seen before, not in the lifetime of the Egyptians, in the history of Egypt will they have seen anything this bad or see anything this bad again when it comes to a swarm of locusts. So this information has been passed on. We've now got a bit of an idea of what we mean by a swarm of locusts. And for most of the other times, or a lot of the other times we've seen when Moses and Aaron have gone to speak to Pharaoh, they've waited his answer. They've waited on what his response is going to be. But interestingly, this time they don't wait for a response. They just tell him and they leave. But we can see the advisors to Pharaoh realise the seriousness of this plague and what a plague of locusts would do. And the advisors, as we started to see last week, in terms of some of the Egyptians, were starting to soften. We're starting to see actually maybe this God is someone we should be listening to rather than fighting against. They've witnessed what God's already done. They've witnessed what is happening to their country. And if they've got any frame of reference on locusts like I've just tried to give us here, that will be something they do not want to experience after excuse me, going on in front of the camera, after everything else that they have seen and experienced already. This will be the last thing that they want to happen next. So we see the advisors are trying to encourage Pharaoh to think, do we need to look at this again? Do we need to give a different answer? Do we need to almost bargain or negotiate with Moses to lessen what this plague might end up being like? But those of us that are watching this, that have a faith, that have an understanding of God, and as we can really see from these verses, you don't negotiate with God. There is something that I think as Christians, if you are a Christian watching this, we battle with constantly. And it's this idea of obedience, of how far do we have to go to obey God, to do what God's asking of us. And something God is doing here and is trying to do through Moses, and we see with how Moses is keeping on going back, is full obedience and trust in God, in what God's doing, in what he is asking of us. Moses doesn't want to meet part way. Moses wants the people to be let go. But we can see Pharaoh doesn't understand this and still thinks he's got this equality with the God that Moses is talking about, and that he still has some power, that he can still win God round or even talk him down from this 8th plague or any future plagues. But something else that Moses is really aware of is that God's plans and ways are perfect. And Moses is going to keep going till the people are let go. Pharaoh's only reason for negotiation is to stop the plagues, not to stop the slavery or to release God's people. And Moses also knows here that if only the men are allowed to leave, which is what Pharaoh's intimating here, he knows they won't want to go. When the women, the children, so many are being left behind, they won't go. But Pharaoh also knows if he lets everyone go, none of them, after a few days of worshipping God, are going to return to slavery. And so we see this impasse, this almost Pharaoh's try of negotiation. And it's, who are you negotiating with here? You're negotiating with God. God has got a plan. God has got his purpose, and he wants that to work out, and it will. So Pharaoh kind of dismisses Aaron and Moses to go. And then we get this incredible description of these locusts arriving overnight into Egypt. And we read the devastation. And hopefully I've set a bit of the scene of what that might have been like. But let's just think on the other things. Not only were locusts, or are locusts, really good at eating and devouring anything and everything that's put in front of them. So anything in terms of food, crops would have then just gone. They'd have just had all of that. Anything left from the other plagues, they would have then destroyed. But also locusts bite. Locusts, they would have been biting the people, and whilst it's not necessarily dangerous, it would have been painful for the people that were bitten by the locusts. There's also a thought that the locusts would have created waste themselves because of all the eating, and any waste could have contaminated the Nile water, could have contaminated the drinking water, would have covered the land, the area where they are as well. So that kind of contamination would have been there. The noise of their swarming activities, of their buzzing, of their flying would have been loud. And just the fact that the thought is that when swarms of locusts are that big, they kind of crush each other in vying for the space and trying to get to the food and all of that as well. Not pleasant, horrible sound, horrible smell probably, not nice, and potentially no more food and no uncontaminated drinking water. So we totally see why Pharaoh, as soon as starts to happen, is shouting for Moses and Aaron to come back, and come back quite quickly. And Pharaoh knows when he calls them back that the negotiations didn't work. They didn't solve anything. So he goes back to the last thing we saw in last week's notes, of where he talks on this word of he's sinned and asking God to forgive him. But Pharaoh doesn't say he'll pray to God himself. He asks Moses to pray for him. Now, one thought on this is of why doesn't he just pray himself? Why doesn't he do it? Is because of the Egyptian understanding of this. At that time, the Egyptians believed that the only person who could speak to a deity would have been a special messenger or priest. And that's who he would have seen Moses as being. So it wasn't really I'm not going to pray, or I don't believe in prayer, but almost. It wouldn't have probably even maybe come into his frame of reference as something to do. And again, we know, does he even really believe in this God, in our God, at this point in time, because he's being so dismissive? And we know as well, the reason he's asking for forgiveness is for the plague to stop, not because Pharaoh sees he needs to humble himself before God. And we then see God answers Moses' prayer. I think if I was Moses at that point, I'd have been quite fearful of what's God going to say? What's he going to do here? Is he actually going to get the locusts away? Because he knows what Pharaoh's heart is in all of this still. But God answers Moses' prayer, and the locusts are gone. And as soon as they're gone, Pharaoh's heart is hardened again. And it might feel this week like things are being a bit repetitive. We're just seeing Pharaoh keep on saying one thing, doing another, saying one thing, heart is then hardened once God has answered the prayer and removed the plague. But it does make me think it's probably worth us pausing with today's verses and just think for a few moments on this idea of Pharaoh being in this place where he is so stubborn, where his self-belief is so strong. It makes me think, God, never let me get to be that way. Never let me be so stubborn that I can't hear you, that I can't see you, or see it when you're asking me to do something. So I want to encourage us with today's verses, as horrible as this plague of locusts sounds. My prayer for me, for us, is that our response to this will be one of saying, God, help me be obedient to you. Help me trust you. Help me not to have a stubborn or a hard heart, but to be open to your rule, to your reign in my life. And to almost use this as a moment to commit my life, your life, back to God, saying, God, I trust you in all that you do and all that you're asking of me. So let that be our prayer today, to not be hard of heart, to not be stubborn when it comes to God, but to trust him and be obedient. God bless.